Today, we are diving deep into one of the most fascinating stories from the early days of Indian cinema, all happening at the legendary Gemini Studios. The story is called Poets and Pancakes, and let me tell you, it is every bit as weird and wonderful as it sounds.
Well, somehow they all crashed together in one place, Gemini Studios. It sounds like the beginning of a strange joke, right? But stick with me here, because the answer reveals this incredible mix of art, ambition, and even Cold War politics, all happening where you'd least expect it. Okay, let's get into this.
So our story kicks off now with the poets, but with the pancakes. We're about to step inside the makeup room at Gemini Studios, and wow, what a place. We're talking fiery misery and a social ladder that was no joke.
And no, we're going to talking about the kind you have for breakfast. Pancake was the brand name for this super heavy-duty makeup. And Gemini Studios, they bought it by the truckload. This wasn't just some local stuff either. It was used by huge international stars like Greta Garbo. It was, quite literally, the foundation of the studio's on-screen look.
But here's the wild part. The whole point wasn't to make the actors look good in person. Oh no. The job of the makeup team was to slather on layers of this stuff under these blazing hot lights until the actors looked, and I'm quoting here, like hideous crimson-hued monsters. Why? All just so they'd look halfway decent on old-school black and white film.
And inside this bizarre makeup room, there was this incredibly strict hierarchy. You had the chief, who only worked on the main stars. His assistants got the supporting actors. And then, way down at the bottom of the ladder, you had the office boy. His job? To mix this pancake makeup in a giant vat and just slap it under the faces of the extras in the crowd. But this office boy, well, he wasn't a boy at all.
Okay, so let's shift from the pancakes to the poets, because that office boy, who was actually a man in his 40s, was also an aspiring poet, and his frustration is really at the heart of the studio's daily drama. A frustration he pointed squarely at one single person. And this contrast really tells you everything about life at the studio. On one side, you've got the office boy, bitter, angry, completely convinced that his genius was being wasted painting faces. And on the other side, Kothamangalam Subbu, the undisputed #2 guy at the studio. Subbu was always cheerful, loyal to a fault, and a creative powerhouse that pretty much everyone admired, except for our office boy, of course.
And it's easy to see why Subbu was so successful. I mean, the man was practically born for the film industry. If a producer had a problem, Subbu would fire off like 14 different solutions on the spot. He was a poet, a novelist, a fantastic actor, and just an incredibly generous guy. He was basically the creative engine of Gemini Studios, while our poor office boy was still stuck in the makeup room.
So, you've got this strange little universe of makeup monsters and jealous poets. But things are about to get a whole lot weirder because the outside world comes knocking twice, and in the most mysterious ways imaginable.
Now, first, you got to understand the political vibe inside the studio. Most of the folks there were followers of Gandhi. They wore traditional khadi cloth and had this deep, gut-level dislike for communism. To them, a communist was basically a godless person who could do anything terrible. And this belief, it's the key to the whole mystery.
So, flash forward to 1952. Two very strange things happen. First, this group of about 200 people from all over the world called the Moral Rearmament Army shows up and just stays at the studio. Then, only a few months later, another visitor arrives, a single, solitary poet from England.
The MRA put on these two really professional plays that totally wowed the local theater scene. It was only years later that the author figured out what they were really about. They were an international anti-communist movement. And the studio boss, Mr. Vossen, had welcomed them with open arms because of it.
But hey, if the MRA visit was a mystery that got solved later, the next one was a total puzzle right from the start. The studio cleared out an entire stage to welcome a poet from England. But who on earth was he?
Nobody knew, and I mean nobody. The staff there prided themselves on knowing literature. You know, Wordsworth, Tennyson, the classics. But this guy, never heard of him. What's even funnier is that the boss, who gave this huge welcoming speech, didn't seem to have a clue who his guest was either.
So that's problem number one. Problem number two, even if they knew who he was, they couldn't understand a single word he said. His English accent was so, well, English, that his entire speech was just gibberish to the Tamil-speaking audience. Can you just picture it? This unknown poet from England talking about the thrills and travails of an English poet to a room full of completely bewildered Indian filmmakers and makeup artists.
The author says the poet himself looked just as confused as everyone else. The whole visit was a complete and total mystery.
So the poet left, and the mystery just hung in the air. But the story's not over. Not by a long shot. Now we're going to jump forward in time, because our author eventually cracks the case.
Years go by. The author doesn't even work at Gemini Studios anymore. And then, just by pure chance, he stumbles upon a clue.
He spots an ad for a story contest in a British magazine he'd never heard of, called The Encounter. Curious, he heads over to the British Council Library to check it out.
And there it is. As he's flipping through an issue, he sees the editor's name. Stephen Spender. Suddenly, a bell starts ringing in his head. That was him. That was the guy. The mysterious poet finally had a name. But that still didn't answer the big question. Why was he at a film studio in South India?
The final piece of the puzzle came even later, and from the most random place, a pile of used books being sold on a sidewalk for pennies. He bought one for 50 paise, mostly just because it was so cheap. The book's title was The God That Failed.
So what was this book? It turned out to be a collection of essays by 6 really famous writers. And the theme was the same for every single one. It was about their journey into communism and then their bitter, disillusioned journey back out. The whole book was basically a powerful anti-communist statement.
And as our author read the list of people who wrote essays for the book, the whole mystery just clicked. There he was, Stephen Spender. The boss of Gemini Studios probably didn't care one bit about Spender's poetry, but he absolutely cared that Spender had written an essay in The God That Failed. He wasn't invited as a poet, he was invited as an ex-communist, a trophy for the studio's own anti-communist beliefs. The puzzle was finally solved.
And that just leaves us with this final thought, doesn't it? A story that starts with makeup and jealous artists in a film studio ends up being all about the global politics of the Cold War. It just goes to show you that fascinating stories are hiding everywhere, connecting worlds you never ever thought could meet.